How had it gotten like this? To say I do not quite remember would be me doing my memory a disservice, even though I wished now more than anything that I could just forget. Forget what I had gone through. Forget what they passed through. But I still remember the sounds and their pleas. I remember the putrid smell that invaded my nostrils and threatened to drive me insane. The rotten smell from a being that rid me of the one thing I held dear. How did it begin again? Yes, it started with darkness, as most things did. My mind, like space, was filled with darkness and nothingness, and it remained that way until the void's consistency was perturbed. Piloted by a crew of 7, our ship, the Phoenix Ark, floated through the expanding void of space as it made its way to Creer W94. We had been away from Earth for 8 months. We had just been woken from our cryogenic sleep by the monotonous beeping of the Phoenix Ark. I was awake. My recovery time from cryogenic sleep was slower than back on Earth. This was no drill. Where the others took some minutes to get over the drowsiness and discombobulating effect of the cryogenic sleep, it took me almost a seeming eternity to get over it. The semi-autonomous systems had put off the artificial gravity at our re-emergence as a protective measure in case we grew faint and fell. It also served as a means of faster navigation through the ship. The others didn't take long to begin floating and stretching as recommended. Me, I tucked myself into the corner and tried to weather the onset of what was surely a pounding migraine. "William, are you okay?" Concerned Annika, the chief engineer, asked even as she futilely tried to stifle the excitement in her voice from all the floating she and the others were doing. "Good," I answered abruptly before I sent her back to floating. My body was simply reacting poorly to being let out of a freezer after 8 months. After the worst had passed, I angled my head up, looked past my floating crew, and ogled the interior of the ship we were floating in. The Phoenix, or as it was more commonly known, the Phoenix Ark, was the 3rd iteration of ships engineered by NASA as part of the Phoenix program. I chuckled a bit at the irony. The program and ship had been part of another failed program called the BBB program. The BBB program had been scrapped. According to some pundits, it had been a total failure, especially considering its lackluster performance versus the amount of money that went into it. The program had been such a failure that it had triggered a round of firing and replacements in the organization. After the storm from the old program had passed, a new program to explore the stars was born. The Phoenix program came to be in demand following the discovery of the new planet, Creer W94. The new world was a mystery, as it had seemingly appeared out of nowhere, as that part of space had been ranked over to them. Caught in my thoughts about the bureaucratic affairs, I stayed in the corner seat for a while before unbuckling the belt that kept me grounded and commanded a systems check. We were getting closer to the planet, and the last thing we wanted was the ship falling apart because we were too preoccupied with floating in space. We began clearing each part of the ship, one after another, and before long, we could say the Phoenix was in proper working order. It had been a reason to breathe a sigh of relief. But Luca didn't think so. "I have a bad feeling," he said. Of course, I thought to myself, he always did. "Why?" I asked, even though I was convinced it was just superstition. "We're nearing Gria W94. Not only are we behind schedule, he pointed to one of the screens in his space, keeps going haywire. Plus, I had a dream." Luca was the second mate, so the news about the equipment wasn't something to be overlooked. I drew closer and checked his readings. "Isn't that normal for the amount of disruption we just had?" I asked. "It is, but—" "It is nothing," I said rather harshly than I had intended the words to be. I did my best as captain to reassure him. Our mission was to orbit the planet, deploy the capsule carrying the rover, and nothing more. As for the dream, it had been said that there were no dreams in space. I couldn't tell how true that was. I had problems dreaming, as I hadn't dreamt in years. The last dream I had was as a 7-year-old boy. "There are no dreams up here," I said to him. "Only abstractions of space. As for being behind schedule, don't worry. We will make up for the delay soon." He looked at me with eyes that told me he wanted to say more reasons why he didn't feel right about our mission. I looked at him with eyes that told him I didn't care to hear more about his superstition. I should have listened. At that moment, I should have aborted the mission and made a return trip to Earth. But I didn't. To say the mission hadn't gone as planned was an understatement. The truth, in retrospect, was that no one could be blamed for how the ship went down. The planet we found ourselves on was cruel. We didn't just know it yet, but we would. With each passing sound, with each individual strand of breeze, we would know. One of us was dead already. It wasn't long before we came into range with the Gria W94. The discovery of the planet had been one that sparked a lot of debates. First, the planet had been discovered. An observatory had announced the discovery of an intrusion in the night sky. Still, they couldn't quite determine what it was. The likelihood of a new planet brought issues, with several governments accusing each other of drumming up planets where there were none. It had taken building a special telescope for taking pictures to get the arguments to stop, and even then, it hadn't. Some still needed verification that the images being sent were not an after-image of some sort or flaring from heat. An orbiter and a rover had also been sent before it could be announced as official. The way I saw it, the orbiting flight and the deployment of a new and improved rover, we were the fifth wave of confirmation. Looking at the planet, there was no doubt in my mind that the planet was real. The sight in front of my eyes had a chaotic beauty that neither the crew nor I could explain. The planet's hue hadn't been that far off from what the telescopes, the rovers, and the mechs had sent back in the early days of the discovery. Our job was now to take a lap around the planet, just like the president had described in his press brief. But even in this trance brought about by the beauty of the planet, I felt a chill run down my spine that I couldn't explain. This was my second warning, but I failed to listen. "Let's earn our pay," I ordered, putting aside the shudder. Everyone was at their station. We began a slow descent so as not to get caught up in an orbit stronger than the Phoenix could handle. I looked at the readings as the Ark disengaged from the autopilot. "Ease into it," I said to Hayden as I asked Luca for the readings. The mission's success couldn't afford a mistake where we entered an orbit where the planet's pull was stronger. Luca called out, and the reading, the Phoenix was about to move to the lower, and that was when it happened. The pull suddenly became stronger. "Pull it up! Pull it up!" I ordered, and the reply came that it couldn't be pulled up from, and that was when we nosedived into the planet.
"Brace for impact."
The Phoenix system blared out.
"Brace for impact."
Although the Phoenix made it into the planet, the nightmare hadn't ended. Every crevice in the Phoenix arc creaked from the vast amount of pressure pressing down on them. Instinctively, I shouted some commands. We had to make it down safely, but we didn't. The Phoenix crashed. Time, marked only by the cacophony of beeps, seemed to last for another eternity in the surrounding darkness. The more I tried to open my eyes to let light in, the more things seemed to fade away beyond any graspable meaning. It was the cryogenic sleep all over again, but with more pain and a fricking headache that threatened to consume my very being. The more I tried to will myself back to consciousness, the more it evaded me. Without opening my eyes, I looked up, and there it was. Something looking back at me before I could peer into the darkness. Annika's voice woke me up. Her voice was followed by a series of beeps that rang throughout the hull of the Phoenix. I woke, and everywhere seemed to be covered in darkness. I couldn't tell if this was just how things were, or if my sight was still recovering. It turned out to be the latter. I knew when the emergency lights came on. Somehow, the ship had landed without totally falling apart. Groping my way through the ship, I searched for the buttons and engaged the emergency light. They came on with a buzz akin to that of a bug zapper. "Can someone put off that fucking noise?" The beep slowly faded after that. We began a sound-off to ensure everyone was okay. Everyone had spoken, except for Oscar. Madison had tried but failed to resuscitate him. We had to bury him, as the cryopods were no longer functional. "What happened there?" I asked Hayden after wiping a tear from my eyes. "I don't know," he said as he removed Madison's hand and held the bandage in the bloodied place. "You should ask Luca," he said with irritation ringing through every syllable he spoke. Wordlessly, I turned and looked at Luca.
"I don't know. It felt like something was pulling the ship."
"Not again with the superstition crap," I said, tired of hearing about his feelings.
"I mean it, William. Something was pulling, driving the readings all over the place."
"That would be you, moving us into the orbit we were supposed to avoid," Hayden replied. "There isn't any need to fight," Annika said as she stepped into the middle. She reminded us that although the mission had gone a bit sideways, we were still on a mission, and Oscar would have wanted us to complete it. She was right. We needed to assess our condition. Finish the mission, I mouthed. Captain? That might be easier said than done," a voice came from behind. "Why? What is it this time?" "It seems we've lost the payload." "Great," I said. "Just great." After assessing the ship, it turned out that the rough landing had injured the ship to the extent that it would take days to repair. Dark here was tricky. The darkness here wasn't like the dark back on Earth. It fluttered with intervals of incandescent lights. We will split into 2 groups, a set to go after the pod, another to stay and repair the ship. Okay, they all said, before moving back into their now dysfunctional cryopods that served as beds. That night, I saw hills of bodies and of blood. That night, I dreamed. We split into 2 parties. I led the party to recover the pod that had been knocked loose during our entry, while Annika stayed behind to man the repair of the Phoenix. With me came Luca and Madison. I had wanted to change Luca for someone else, as his superstition seemed to be rubbing off on me. I was seeing things that weren't there, but Annika needed everyone I could spare. Before we left, we traded in our normal attire for the new improved spacesuits and headed out for the last known location of the pod. If we were lucky, we would recover it not too far from where we crashed and return in one piece. We were not. At intervals during our trek to recover the last pod, I would catch a slight sound of Lucas saying a prayer. I didn't interrupt him, each to his own. Oscar's death weighed deeply on all of us. I was still thinking about our landing when the sound sped past me. "Did you hear that?" I said as I drew closer to Madison. "What?" she replied with a confused look as she tried to listen for the sound. She didn't hear anything. I kept it to myself, each to his own. We hadn't found a thing on our first day of searching, and had to return to the crash site. Night came, and I was the only one awake. Unable to sleep, I pulled out a digital map, overlaid it onto a physical map, and marked out the areas searched. I smelt it when I was about to mark out areas for the next day. This was the first time I smelt it. My first thought was that Billy had farted, but the smell had a burning sensation. The more I tried to ignore it, the worse it got. I put on my suit and moved out of the Phoenix. I was temporarily distracted by the incandescent nature of the night sky. I didn't get lost in it. The noise got louder. I tried but failed to find out where it was coming from, but before the noise could collide with me, and it disappeared. I was just overthinking things. I shook my head and went inside. That night, I dreamt again. The same dream, but this time with a terrifying growl. We moved out the next day. We had to find the pod before it became dark. I got on the comms and tried to radio back our progress. No reply, just pure static that sounded more and more irritating. I almost punched it before remembering the others looking up to me as the beacon of hope. I resolved to try out the radio later the next day. My progress was slow. I couldn't shake off the feeling that we were being followed, and it had only worsened since the previous night. My mind flew to Luca. Maybe my psyche was being affected by him. But despite how hard I tried to shake it off, I couldn't stop looking behind to ensure nothing was on our trails. We were moving over a rocky terrain when I heard the noise from my dream. So real was the voice I heard that I tripped and tumbled down the hill. After the fall, I had tried moving, only to shout out in pain. Had I broken my leg? Luca and Madison caught up not long after, and moved to pull him up from the ground when I noticed the mold in the ground. I stepped to the side, or to be more precise, I hopped and bent as I checked it to ascertain what this was. At first, I thought it might have been a rock, but closer inspection revealed it to be a footprint of some sort, and looked nothing like a human's.
"What is it?"
Luca asked. "Nothing," I replied. He didn't need anything to fuel his superstition. We kept walking after Madison helped with my leg. The trek had been slower than when we began. I would have liked to blame it on my leg, but the truth was more than that. Was there life on this planet? The question slipped into my mind, causing me to remember the brief we had gotten from the scientist at NASA. The answer to the question hadn't been certain, but some of them theorized that if there was life, it would probably be nothing but plant life. I repeated it just in my head, even as I forced my legs to move. We hadn't come close to finding the pod on the second day either. We returned to the Phoenix, short of another member. There had been a storm, and Luca had gotten separated during it. We searched for him for days, but the more we searched, the more we came up with nothing. It was almost as if he hadn't even been there in the first place. I called a meeting amongst the remaining crew. It had to be said. There was no need to hide it now. "William, what is this about?" Annika asked. "There is something wrong with this planet. I don't know what it is, but we need to get off it now."
"What do you mean, get off it?"
Hayden exclaimed.
"One of us was lost in the storm. We haven't found him yet. We can't just tuck tail and abandon him on this planet."
I tried explaining, or trying to explain, that I didn't think Luca was lost in a storm. He had been taken. I feel like... I stopped to listen to myself. I expected this to come from Luca and not from me. I was still contemplating with my sanity when Billy spoke out. "You feel like something is watching you at all times, waiting for something before it strikes," Billy chipped in. I almost jumped with relief. At least I would have if my leg permitted. Billy continued. "I noticed it on the second day we landed. There was this hissing sound. I thought I'd developed tinnitus, but I soon began seeing these flashes after the hisses. Eyes." "What are you saying? That something is haunting us?" Annika asked Billy and me. We were about to reply when she spoke up. "It doesn't matter. We are going to find Luca before any talk of leaving." I sat back down and remained silent as they went to bed in preparation for the search the next day. That night, I dreamt again. It was troubling now. The dream had come at me so quickly that it forced me to wake up. I woke up in cold sweat and chill, which only got more unnerving when I looked up, only to see it. Immediately I stepped out of bed. I knew it was there. The ship smelt horrible. My eyes watered and burned as they would when exposed to some nerve gas. I put a cloth over my nose. It smelt stale, but stale wasn't the first thing that hit my nose. Putrid was. It was here. My guess was backed up by the chaos that filled the Phoenix. The walls had been ripped up. If I didn't know better, I would have said someone was searching for something. But for what? I mused to myself. "Hello? Annika?" I called, but there was no reply. I called out to Hayden, and there was still no answer. Had they neglected to tell me they were stepping out? What about the rest? Had they gone out to search for the pod on their own because I was slowing them down? They wouldn't have done so, I concluded. I called out to them again. It wasn't until I saw their gloves were still here that I began to worry. They wouldn't have gone out without it. Annika wouldn't have allowed it. Everything was turning. I couldn't breathe, the rhythm of my heart outracing the thoughts in my brain. I pulled myself up and looked out, and that's when he saw it. The ship's floor was covered in a dark fluid. "What is this?" I mouthed as I bent down and touched the ground. My eyes widened in panic, and my sphincter clenched with thoughts of what could happen. I hopped back into Phoenix as I darted from the unseen beast. I moved to the comms and tried radioing them, but there was no reply. Maybe the radio was faulty or something. It wasn't, but maybe it was. I rested my back against the wall, one eye on the ripped-out door of the Phoenix, one on the radio as I adjusted the dials repeatedly and tried again. One trial was rewarded by a click that signified the connection had gone through. This time, I heard a scream from Madison, followed by static. The pain in her voice was maddening. My mind was still running over options when I looked up and saw that the blood had formed a trail. After thinking about my next action, I packed as much gear as I could manage with a bad leg and moved in the direction of my crew. I was only some way out of the Phoenix before it began again. It sounded like a hiss from 100 snakes slithering in my direction. As much as I liked to think it was all in my head, I knew now that this wasn't a dream. Something was on my trail. Something was on this rock of a planet, and it had taken my crew and left me behind. The weather had begun to act up, and I could hear the lightning clash in anticipation of the appointed time. The winds also opined, pushing me back as if to warn me that only death waited for me beyond this point. But I ignored it and continued. I continued no matter how harsh it got. My heart spiked with every step I took, and I felt every strain of the pain bite into me. I ignored both sensations. I had to find them. It didn't matter what it took. I had only walked a few miles when I stopped to rest. I was almost dozing off from the pain and tiredness when the sounds of this thing haunting me began again. Armed with nothing but a flare gun and long rod that was once part of the Phoenix, I took a wide stance, ready to face this thing. This monster. For the first time since my trials began, I heard another sound. A cackle of some sort. It sounded like laughter at my pain and defiance. "Where are you?" I shouted as I gripped my weapons tight as adrenaline passed through me. "Show yourself." There was a scurry of feet, faster than my eyes could follow, but I saw a part of it. The scale of this beast, of this creature, knocked the wind out of me, and I staggered to the floor. What was it waiting for? For me to go completely mad? I wouldn't grant it that. I rested against a big stone and began fiddling with the comms frequency. Something had to go through. I reached a channel that wasn't all static. "William," the voice said as it morphed into part static and part voice. "I can't hear you, Annika. Where are you?" Do you have coordinates? Help us. Help us, Annika said before the channel died. Continuing walking after that was a problem. My mind was filled with doubts. The entire expedition was proof of my failure as a captain. What chance did I stand? My mind kept telling me I had to return to the ship. It was going to be cold soon, and deadly. Turning back, I began to hear the wind. I wouldn't make it back. Getting caught here would mean death. Maybe we deserved it. I mean, who were we to try and leave the planet of our birth? This was going to be the end, I thought to myself. I am ready for death, I muttered under my breath. I am ready to die, I repeated to myself under my breath to steady myself. Maybe if I was more prepared, it would be less painful. It didn't make sense, but it was all I had. The wind had progressed to more than just a whisper. It had transformed into a raging wind. I looked up at it and was about to look away when I saw it in the way. It was a cave. I didn't know it at first, but when the realization hit, I rose to my feet and ran to it. My desperate attempt to beat the wind worked. The cave was standing strong. My goal was to spend the night and resume the next day. The wind had other plans. I stayed there, and I surfaced from the cave when it was over. In the distance I saw a familiar color. It was Luca. I ran up to him and saw... All I will say is that he died in my arms, not before telling me about the monster. The entrance to this cave began at my foot and spanned the length of a small mountain. Images of Luca and the words he had spoken breezed through my mind.
Run. Save yourself.
I shook my head to displace the thought and stop it from taking root. I was going to save them. Nothing was more important now, not even the mission. I felt it again, the chill I felt at the beginning of the mission. Again I shook it and surged into the cave as carefully as possible. The cave floor was filled with an off-white material that gave off a rippling noise, no matter how much care I put into walking on it. The cave being an echo chamber, the noise bounced off the walls into the furthest part of the cave. With the flare gun in my hand, my eyes roamed the cave for any sight of my crew. I did. A trail of blood leading further into the cave was on the floor just in front of me. I took a deep breath, gathered my thoughts, and proceeded further into the cave. There was another opening. Although it was still huge, it stood much smaller than the first one I had entered. The smell lived here and was even more nauseating now than ever. I walked in and I saw it. Its skin was slimy, and the light shining through the cave reflected off it in a sickly mirror. How had it been able to move so fast? It wasn't important now. I only had 2 bullets, 2 cartridges. I had to make them count. I didn't know how yet, but I knew I had to. It was asleep. My eyes traveled the length of the body, and in the middle was the pod we were searching for. That is why the signal kept on moving, I thought to myself. I was about to move to the other side when I heard a whimpering. Whimpering in another cave. I moved to the left, entering the cave, And that was when I saw something that made my stomach drop. Hanging on the cave's ceiling were my crew. Their eyes had been ripped out of their socket. "Who is there?" they chorused. I couldn't catch my breath or stop the tears rushing down my face fast enough to reply to them. I tried to call myself, but before I could, the cave shook. The monster was up. "I am going to get all of you down," I whispered as I moved to a hidden part of the cave. The beast entered the cave. Its skin was slimy, even as it stretched like a serpent. The bulk was just as big as the cave entrances I had entered through. It sniffed me out almost immediately. I fired the first flare and missed. It was only after the flare hit me that I realized I was standing. These were bones, and for the first time I saw its face. Its face was made of eyes. I stood there, all my strength drained out of me. One of the hands grabbed me. I was ready to die. There was no need living anymore. And that was when I heard their voice begging me to help them. I was still weak, but I was strong enough. I picked up the flare gun and fired one shot at its eyes. It dropped me on the floor as it let a screech. Before it could recover, I took the shaft and pierced it into the beast's brain. There was a loud screech, and that was the end of it. At least, I wished it was. I took the pod and went south with it. That's where I am recording this, hoping someone back on Earth will get this. My crew, they begged me to end it. The damage had been too much for them to love through. I am not so sure I want to go back anymore. Not after what I did. Not after hearing the hisses again. I am the last member of the crew member of the Phoenix Ark, and this is my last communication. Hey, sci-fi horror fans. It's Thomas. Thanks for listening. To connect with and support us, make sure to check out our Discord and Patreon links in the description. And remember, stay cosmic.